there is a kind of devotion that looks, from the outside, like a lack of imagination. This is the story of a potter who spent 40 years shaping clay exactly the way his master had taught him, and who had to lose his workshop's only other set of hands before he finally shaped something that was entirely his own. In a town known for its pottery, there was a potter who had trained since boyhood under a master craftsman whose bowls and jars were prized throughout the region. The master's technique was distinctive and exact. A particular curve to the lip of a bowl, a particular thickness at the base, a particular way of turning the wheel that produced a surface so even it seemed almost too perfect to have been made by hand. The potter learned every part of this technique with total devotion, and by the time his own son was old enough to take an interest in the craft, the potter had been shaping pots in exactly his master's style for nearly 40 years. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily skilled. His bowls were indistinguishable from his master's, so precise in their proportions that long-time customers sometimes could not tell, without checking the maker's mark, whether a piece had come from the master's own hands decades earlier or from the potter's wheel that very morning. This was, in the potter's mind, the highest compliment his work could receive. He had never set out to make something new. He had set out to honor something already perfect, and to pass it on unchanged. His son grew up in that workshop the way the potter himself once had, learning the same curve, the same thickness, the same turn of the wrist. For years, the two of them worked side by side at neighboring wheels, and the workshop produced pottery so consistent that a customer could not have said which wheel a given bowl had come from. The potter took quiet pride in this. It meant, to him, that the technique was truly alive, passed faithfully from one pair of hands to the next. The son, though, began to change the shapes in small ways almost as soon as he had mastered the original technique well enough to deviate from it safely. A slightly wider lip here, a faint asymmetry there, left in on purpose rather than corrected. At first, these were barely noticeable, small enough that the potter told himself they were simply the natural imprecision of a younger hand still finding its rhythm. But over the years, the differences grew more deliberate and more frequent until it became clear that his son was not failing to copy the technique. He was choosing not to. The potter found this difficult to watch, though he rarely said so directly. He would sometimes reach over at his son's wheel and gently correct a lip that had flared too wide, or smooth a seam his son had left visibly rough on purpose. His son took these corrections politely and would sometimes leave the piece as corrected, and sometimes, once the potter had moved on, quietly reshape it back toward his own version. Neither of them spoke much about what this meant. It simply became a quiet, ongoing negotiation between two wheels in the same room. Then, one spring, the son announced that he intended to open a workshop of his own in a neighboring town where he had found a patron willing to support new and unusual designs. He asked his father to give his blessing, which the potter gave, because there was no honest way to refuse a grown son the same trade the potter himself had once been given as a young man. But the morning his son finally packed his tools and left, the potter found himself standing alone at two silent wheels for the first time in decades. The workshop felt larger than it had ever felt before, and quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of noise. Tools his son had left behind still hung in their place on the wall, and the second wheel sat motionless in the corner, gathering a fine layer of dust that no one came anymore to disturb. The potter returned to his own wheel that first week and shaped bowls exactly as he always had, the same curve, the same thickness, the same faithful repetition of his master's design. But something about working entirely alone, with no second wheel turning beside his own, made the repetition feel different than it ever had before. For 40 years, the sameness of his work had felt like devotion. Now in the empty workshop, it began to feel like something closer to habit. He tried for a while to ignore this feeling, the way he had ignored so many small discomforts over the decades in favor of the discipline his master had instilled in him. But one afternoon, shaping a bowl that was, in every measurable way, identical to the thousands he had made before it, he found his hands slowing at the lip, hesitating in a way they never had before. He set the tool down and looked at the bowl for a long while, turning it slowly in his hands, searching for some flaw that might explain his hesitation. There was no flaw. It was, as always, perfect. It was the perfection itself, he realized, that had stopped him. He had spent 40 years ensuring that his hands added nothing of his own to what his master had already perfected, and for the first time, alone in a workshop that had once held two wheels, he wondered what his own hands might have made if he had ever once let them. He did not decide this all at once. It began instead with a single afternoon when he sat at his wheel with no commission waiting, no customer to satisfy, and let the clay rise under his hands without correcting it back toward the familiar shape. He allowed the lip to flare wider than his master would have permitted. He left a faint asymmetry in the base rather than smoothing it away. He worked slowly, uncertain in a way he had not felt at the wheel since he was a boy first learning the craft, because for the first time in decades, there was no established shape to measure his work against. The bowl that emerged from that afternoon was, by his master's standards, imperfect. The lip was uneven in a way no customer would have accepted from the workshop's usual output. But he found himself unable to put it aside, the way he would have discarded any piece that failed to meet the standard he had upheld his entire working life. He set it instead on a shelf near his wheel, apart from the rows of identical faithful bowls that filled the rest of the workshop, and left it there. He did not stop making his master's design. Customers still came for the pottery they had always known, and he still shaped it with the same devoted precision he always had, because that work remained honest and worth doing well. But in the quiet hours when no commission was waiting, he returned again and again to his own imperfect shapes, refining not toward his master's standard, but toward whatever his own hand seemed to want to make. Years later, when his son visited from his own thriving workshop in the neighboring town, he noticed the shelf near his father's wheel, filled now with a small but growing collection of bowls, unlike anything the old master had ever taught. He asked, carefully, whether his father minded that his own designs had once seemed to depart from everything the family workshop stood for. The potter told him that he had spent 40 years believing devotion meant changing nothing. It was only in the silence of an empty workshop, with no one left to copy and no one left to correct, that he had finally understood devotion could also mean listening to what his own hands had been quietly waiting 40 years to make. On the shelf beside his wheel, his very first imperfect bowl still sat exactly where he had placed it, its uneven lip catching the afternoon light differently every day, standing apart from the hundreds of identical, faithful pieces that surrounded it on every other shelf in the workshop.